What happens when a calm interview suddenly turns into something no one in the studio expected? When a friendly conversation slowly transforms into a moment so tense that the entire audience falls silent, and millions watching from home lean closer to their screens. It was supposed to be just another morning on the set of The View. The lights were bright, the audience energetic, and the panel was ready for a lively conversation. But no one in that studio, producers, audience members, or even the hosts, could have predicted how intense things would become when Jake Gyllenhaal sat across from Sunny Hostin. Before we step into this moment that had everyone talking, make sure you subscribe to Live Narratives, like this video, and drop a comment below, because stories like this only get more shocking as they unfold. The camera slowly panned across the stage as the show returned from commercial break. The familiar theme music faded out while the audience clapped enthusiastically. Sunny Hostin leaned slightly forward at the table, smiling warmly toward the entrance. Please welcome the incredibly talented Jake Gyllenhaal. The crowd erupted. Jake stepped out with his usual calm confidence. Dressed sharply but casually, he gave a quick wave to the audience before walking toward the host's table. There was an easy smile on his face, one that suggested he expected a light-hearted conversation. After all, he had been doing interviews all week promoting his newest project. He greeted the hosts one by one, exchanging polite handshakes before settling into a seat. The applause gradually faded, replaced by the quiet anticipation of the audience. Sunny began with a friendly tone. "Jake, it's great to have you here." Jake nodded politely. "It's great to be here. Thanks for having me." At first, everything felt normal, the type of interview audiences had seen countless times. Sunny asked about his latest film, his preparation for the role, and how intense the production had been. Jake spoke thoughtfully, explaining the emotional depth of the character and the months of preparation he had gone through. "You know," he said calmly, "every role is like stepping into someone else's life. You have to understand their fears, their motivations, even their flaws." The audience listened quietly. Sunny smiled. "And you've played some very complicated characters over the years." Jake chuckled softly. "That's one way to put it." There was laughter from the crowd. But then something shifted. Sunny's smile remained, but her tone subtly changed. The question she asked next wasn't about acting techniques or movie sets. Instead, she leaned forward slightly and said, "Some critics have said that lately your roles seem darker than ever, that they reflect a different side of you personally. Do you think there's truth to that?" Jake blinked once. The question wasn't hostile, but it was unexpected. He paused for a moment before answering. "I think characters are just characters," he said calmly. "They don't necessarily represent who I am." Sunny nodded, but she didn't move on. Instead, she tilted her head thoughtfully. "But don't actors sometimes reveal parts of themselves through the roles they choose?" A faint murmur rippled through the audience. Jake's smile faded slightly, not dramatically, but enough that anyone watching carefully would notice. "Well," he replied slowly sometimes, "but sometimes they just tell stories." Sunny held his gaze. There was a brief silence, and suddenly the energy on the set felt different. Across the table, another host shifted slightly in her chair, sensing the change in tone. Sunny continued, "You've played characters dealing with trauma, violence, obsession. Some people online have wondered if that says something deeper about the types of stories you want to tell." The studio audience grew quieter. Jake's expression tightened, not with anger, but with something more complicated. Measured patience. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "I think," he said carefully, "people sometimes look for meaning where there isn't any." Sunny nodded slowly. "But fans are curious," she added. "They want to understand the man behind those performances." The camera cut briefly to the audience. Some looked intrigued. Others looked slightly uncomfortable. Jake exhaled softly. "I appreciate that curiosity," he said. "But there's also a line between curiosity and assumption." That sentence hung in the air like a quiet warning. Sunny raised an eyebrow slightly. "Assumption?" Jake met her eyes directly now. "Yes." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The tension wasn't explosive. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Sunny smiled again, but this time the smile carried a sharper edge. Well, let's talk about assumptions then. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Even the production crew backstage could feel it now. Something about this interview had started to move in a direction no one expected. Sunny folded her hands together on the table. There's been a lot of discussion lately about actors taking responsibility for the stories they tell, especially when those stories involve violence or psychological manipulation. Jake listened silently. Her voice remained calm, professional, but some critics argue that Hollywood sometimes glamorizes those darker themes. Jake's jaw tightened slightly. Are you asking me if I'm responsible for what audiences take from a fictional story? Sunny replied immediately. I'm asking whether actors think about the influence they have. The audience held its breath. Jake looked down at the table for a second, then back up. His voice was still controlled, but now there was steel in it. Of course we think about it. Sunny leaned back slightly. So, where do you draw the line? Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her for a moment, as if deciding how honest he wanted to be. Around them, the bright studio lights felt hotter. The friendly interview had slowly transformed into something far more serious, and everyone could feel it. Jake finally spoke. I draw the line, he said quietly, at the point where storytelling gets mistaken for endorsement. The audience reacted with a mix of nods and murmurs. Sunny tapped her fingers lightly against a table. But what if people believe those stories shape culture? Jake gave a small smile, the kind that wasn't really a smile. Then maybe we should start asking bigger questions about culture itself. A ripple of surprised laughter passed through the audience. But Sunny didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned forward again. And when she spoke next, her voice carried a seriousness that made the entire studio fall silent. Jake, she said slowly, some people would say that answer avoids the real issue. And in that moment, something changed completely. Jake's expression hardened, not dramatically, but enough that viewers at home would notice immediately. The conversation was no longer just an interview. It was becoming a confrontation. And what happened next would turn this calm morning talk show into one of the most talked about moments in daytime television. For a few seconds after that question, the studio felt almost frozen. Across the table, Jake Gyllenhaal didn't immediately answer. He simply looked at Sunny Hostin, as if measuring the moment carefully. The audience sensed it too, the quiet shift from polite conversation to something far more charged. The cameras kept rolling. Sunny waited patiently, her posture calm but firm. She had asked the question, and she wasn't backing away from it. Jake finally leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together on the table. Avoids the real issue? He repeated, his voice steady. Sunny nodded. Yes. A murmur drifted through the audience. Jake exhaled slowly, choosing his words with care. I think the real issue, he said, is that people often expect artists to explain everything they create. Sunny tilted her head. And you don't think they should? Jake shrugged lightly. I think storytelling has always been about exploring difficult things. The tension was subtle, but unmistakable. A few audience members nodded at Jake's response. Others watched Sunny, curious about how she would push back. Sunny leaned forward again. But exploring something and normalizing it aren't the same thing. Jake raised an eyebrow slightly. That's true, he said. But assuming that audiences can't tell the difference, that's a different conversation. A few people clapped softly. Sunny glanced briefly toward the crowd before returning her focus to Jake. Let's be honest, she said. Movies shape public perception. They influence how people think about violence, justice, morality. So, when an actor repeatedly chooses darker roles, it naturally raises questions. Jake smiled again, but this time the smile carried more tension. Or, he replied calmly, it raises assumptions. The word hung in the air again. Sunny didn't look offended. If anything, she seemed more determined. So, you believe the criticism is unfair? Jake thought about it for a moment. I believe criticism is part of the job, he said. But there's a difference between criticism and trying to psychoanalyze someone based on fictional characters. A ripple of laughter spread through the audience. Even one of the other hosts smiled at that. Sunny didn't laugh this time. Instead, she folded her arms slightly on the table. But you've played characters who are deeply troubled, she continued. Characters who manipulate people, who cross moral lines. Jake nodded. Yes. And those performances are powerful, she admitted. But some viewers wonder if Hollywood celebrates those characters too much. Jake looked thoughtful. Do you think audiences are incapable of critical thinking? He asked. The question landed sharply. A few audience members gasped softly. Sunny raised her eyebrows. That's not what I said. But that's what it sounds like, Jake replied evenly. The tension thickened. On the far side of the table, another host shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing that this conversation was drifting into dangerous territory for a daytime show like The View. Sunny's voice remained composed. I think audiences are very smart, she said, which is exactly why these conversations matter. Jake leaned back again, crossing one leg over the other. And I agree with that. Then let's have a conversation, Sunny replied. For a moment, Jake looked amused. All right. The audience leaned in. Sunny spoke carefully. Do you think actors should feel responsible for the cultural impact of the stories they participate in? Jake's eyes narrowed slightly. Not with anger, but with focus. That's a complicated question. Sunny nodded. It is. Jake paused before answering. Actors bring characters to life, he said slowly. But they don't control how those characters are interpreted. Sunny immediately responded. But they do choose the roles. A few audience members murmured. Jake tilted his head. That's true. Sunny continued. And choices reflect values. Jake gave a quiet chuckle. That's one way to look at it. Sunny leaned forward slightly. How else would you look at it? Jake rested his elbow on the table. I see it as curiosity, he said. Actors are curious about human behavior, the good parts and the uncomfortable parts. Sunny's eyes stayed locked on his. So, you're saying those darker roles are just curiosity? Jake nodded. Yes. Sunny paused. Then she asked a question that instantly changed the tone again. Or, do they resonate with you personally? The audience gasped softly. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Jake's expression didn't change right away, but something in his eyes sharpened. For a moment, he simply stared at Sunny. Then he spoke. That's an interesting question. Sunny held her ground. I think viewers want honest answers. Jake nodded slowly. Honesty is good. He leaned forward again, his voice quieter now, but more intense. But honesty also means recognizing when a question crosses into personal territory that doesn't actually belong to the audience. A ripple moved through the crowd. Sunny's posture stiffened slightly. Public figures live very public lives, she said calmly. Jake smiled faintly. That doesn't mean every personal assumption is fair. The tension in the room had now become impossible to ignore. One of the producers backstage gestured nervously toward the control booth. The segment was starting to feel unpredictable. Sunny glanced briefly toward the other hosts before looking back at Jake. So, you believe that line was crossed? Jake didn't hesitate this time. Yes. The audience reacted immediately. Some clapped. Others exchanged surprised looks. Sunny remained composed, but the atmosphere had clearly shifted. The interview was no longer a polite discussion. It had become a battle of perspectives. Sunny leaned forward one more time. Jake, she said slowly, asking questions is literally my job. Jake nodded. And answering them is part of mine. Another pause. But he added quietly, respecting boundaries should be part of both. A few people in the audience applauded louder this time. Sunny's expression stayed neutral, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes now. Determination. She wasn't done. Not even close. She glanced briefly toward the camera, then back at Jake. All right, she said. Her voice was calm. But the words that followed would push the conversation into territory that neither the producers nor the audience were prepared for. Then let's talk about boundaries. And the moment she said it, everyone in that studio could feel that the interview was about to escalate in a way daytime television rarely sees. The word boundaries lingered in the air like a challenge. Across the table on the set of The View, the tension was no longer subtle. The studio audience could feel it in the silence between sentences, in the careful way both speakers measured their words. Sunny Hostin rested her hands on the table, her posture calm but deliberate. So, let's talk about boundaries, she repeated. Across from her, Jake Gyllenhaal tilted his head slightly. He looked thoughtful, but there was now an unmistakable intensity behind his expression. All right, Jake said quietly. Sunny continued. You mentioned that some questions cross into territory that doesn't belong to the audience. But when someone becomes a global celebrity, when millions of people watch their work and follow their career, doesn't that naturally invite deeper questions? Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers loosely interlocked. The studio lights reflected off the polished surface of the table as the camera slowly zoomed closer. It invites interest, Jake finally said. Sunny nodded, but not entitlement. A few people in the audience murmured in agreement. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Is it entitlement to ask how someone's personal beliefs influence the stories they tell? Jake gave a small, controlled smile. No, he replied. Then he leaned forward slightly. But it becomes entitlement when people assume they already know the answer. The audience reacted with a mix of quiet applause and curious glances. Sunny stayed composed. But isn't that what interviews are for? She said. To explore those answers? Jake nodded slowly. Yes. Another pause. But exploration should go both ways. Sunny's brow furrowed slightly. What do you mean by that? Jake looked around the table briefly, then back at Sunny. I mean, he said calmly, sometimes the questions say as much about the person asking them as they do about the person answering. The audience reacted immediately. A few gasps, a ripple of whispers. Sunny's posture straightened just a little. That's an interesting point, she said carefully. Jake nodded. I think it's an honest one. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The atmosphere had shifted again. What started as a discussion about movies had now turned into something much more personal, something that felt almost philosophical. Sunny broke the silence. So, are you suggesting that my questions reveal something about me? Jake didn't hesitate. Yes. The audience erupted with murmurs. Some people clapped nervously. Others leaned forward, clearly stunned by how direct the conversation had become. Sunny's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. All right, she said slowly. I'm listening. Jake spoke calmly, but there was now a sharp clarity in his voice. I think we live in a time where people want simple answers to complicated questions. Sunny nodded slightly. And sometimes, Jake continued, we project our fears about the world onto artists, actors, storytellers because it's easier than confronting those fears directly. A few members of the audience clapped again. Sunny's expression remained serious. So, you believe critics and journalists are projecting? Jake shrugged lightly. Sometimes. Sunny leaned forward again. But journalism exists to ask difficult questions. Jake nodded. And storytelling exists to explore difficult ideas. The room grew quiet again. Sunny studied him carefully. Do you think actors should ever be challenged? Jake smiled faintly. Of course. Sunny gestured toward the table between them. Then what do you call this? Jake looked around the studio. The cameras. The audience. The bright lights. Then he looked back at Sunny. I'd call this a conversation, he said. A few people laughed softly. Sunny allowed a small smile to appear, but it vanished quickly. Some viewers might call it deflection. Jake chuckled under his breath. That word keeps coming up today. Sunny folded her hands again. Well, viewers are paying attention. Jake leaned forward slightly now, his tone more serious. And I respect that. Another pause settled over the room. The conversation had now become almost hypnotic. The audience wasn't just watching an interview anymore. They were witnessing two very sharp minds carefully pushing against each other. Sunny asked her next question slowly. Let me ask you something directly. Jake nodded. Go ahead. Sunny took a breath. Do you believe actors influence society? Jake answered immediately. Yes. The quickness of the response surprised the audience. Sunny noticed it too. So you do acknowledge that responsibility? Jake nodded again. Yes. Sunny leaned back slightly. Then why resist the conversation about it? Jake's answer came just as quickly. Because influence isn't the same as control. A few audience members clapped loudly. Jake continued. Stories reflect society. They don't create it from nothing. Sunny tilted her head thoughtfully. But they shape how people interpret the world. Jake nodded. They can. Exactly, Sunny said. Jake paused for a moment before replying. But the audience also shapes the story. The room fell silent again. Sunny seemed intrigued. How so? Jake looked out toward the audience. Every viewer brings their own experiences, their own fears, their own beliefs into what they watch. He turned back toward Sunny. So the meaning of a story isn't fixed. It changes depending on who's watching. A few audience members clapped again, louder this time. Sunny remained thoughtful. That's a fair point. Then she leaned forward again. But let me push back just a little. Jake smiled. I expected you would. The audience laughed. Sunny's voice grew slightly firmer. When powerful people tell powerful stories, those stories can normalize certain ideas. Jake nodded slowly. That's true. Sunny looked directly into his eyes. So when violence or obsession becomes entertaining, don't we have to ask why? The audience grew very quiet again. Jake's expression became serious. For the first time since the interview began, he took a longer pause before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but heavier. Because sometimes the most uncomfortable stories are the ones that force us to confront the truth about ourselves. A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Sunny watched him carefully. And what truth is that? Jake's eyes didn't move from hers. That human beings are complicated. Another pause. And pretending otherwise doesn't make the darkness disappear. The studio fell completely silent. Sunny absorbed the answer. But instead of responding immediately, she asked one final question, one that would change the entire energy of the interview once again. Her voice was calm, measured, but the words were sharper than anything she had asked before. Jake, if that's the case, then why do so many people feel uncomfortable watching you talk about it right now? The audience gasped. Even the other hosts at the table turned their heads. Because suddenly the conversation wasn't about movies anymore. It was about Jake himself. And the way Jake reacted in the next few seconds would send the entire interview spiraling into a moment no one on that stage was prepared for. The question landed like a sudden crack of thunder in the quiet studio. For a split second, no one moved. The audience on the set of The View had been following every word of the conversation between Jake Gyllenhaal and Sunny Hostin, but this question felt different. Jake, if that's the case, then why do so many people feel uncomfortable watching you talk about it right now? The cameras stayed locked on Jake. The room was silent enough to hear someone shifting in their seat in the back row. Jake didn't react immediately. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened again. The calm composure he had maintained throughout the interview was still there, but now there was a hint of something deeper behind it. Thoughtfulness. And perhaps just a little frustration. Jake leaned back slightly in his chair and exhaled quietly. Well, he said slowly, I guess the first thing I'd ask is, do they? A murmur rippled through the audience. Sunny didn't blink. You haven't noticed it? She asked. Jake tilted his head slightly. I've noticed that people often say others are uncomfortable when they actually mean they are. A few people in the audience gasped softly. Others clapped. Sunny remained composed, but the tension was clearly building again. That's an interesting interpretation, she replied. Jake gave a small shrug. It's a human one. The cameras briefly cut to the other hosts at the table. One of them shifted slightly in her seat, clearly aware that the conversation had now stepped far outside the safe territory of a typical morning talk show. Sunny folded her hands together again. Let me clarify, she said calmly. There are viewers who feel that discussions like this, about darkness, violence, the human psyche, can feel unsettling when they're presented so casually. Jake nodded thoughtfully. That's fair. The audience seemed surprised by the quick agreement. Sunny noticed it too. You agree? Jake leaned forward slightly. Yes. Sunny paused. But Jake smiled faintly. But discomfort isn't always a bad thing. The audience reacted with a mix of quiet applause and murmurs. Jake continued, his voice steady. Some of the most important conversations in society start with discomfort. Sunny tilted her head. That sounds like something a filmmaker would say. Jake chuckled softly. Well, I do work in storytelling. The tension lightened for a brief moment as the audience laughed. But Sunny wasn't done pushing. Let's go back to something you said earlier, she continued. You mentioned that sometimes people project their fears onto artists. Jake nodded. Yes. Sunny leaned forward again, locking eyes with him. So, what fear do you think people are projecting onto you? The question hung in the air. Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly around the studio. The audience, the cameras, the bright stage lights that illuminated every subtle expression. When he looked back at Sunny, his tone had changed slightly. It wasn't defensive. It was reflective. I think, he said slowly, people are uncomfortable with the idea that art doesn't always offer clear moral answers. The audience listened quietly. Jake continued. In real life, things aren't always simple. People aren't always heroes or villains. Sometimes they're both at the same time. Sunny nodded slightly. That's true. Jake leaned back again. But audiences often want stories to tell them exactly what to think. Sunny raised an eyebrow. You think viewers need moral guidance from movies? Jake shook his head. No. He paused. I think they sometimes expect it. Another murmur spread through the audience. Sunny tapped her fingers lightly on the table. But if a story presents darkness, without clearly condemning it, some people worry that it normalizes it. Jake nodded slowly. I've heard that argument. Sunny leaned forward. And what's your response to it? Jake looked thoughtful again. My response is that pretending darkness doesn't exist doesn't make the world better. The room went quiet again. Jake's voice was calm, but the words carried weight. Stories about difficult things can help people understand them. They can spark conversations that might not happen otherwise. Sunny studied him carefully. So you see those stories as a kind of mirror? Jake nodded. Exactly. Sunny paused for a moment. Then she said something that made several people in the audience shift in their seats. But mirrors can also distort. Jake smiled slightly. That's true. Sunny leaned in just a little closer. And sometimes actors become the face of that distortion. The tension returned instantly. Jake's smile faded. Meaning? Sunny spoke carefully. Meaning that when audiences repeatedly see someone portray certain kinds of characters, they start to associate that actor with those traits. Jake nodded slowly. That happens. Sunny held his gaze. So, does that ever concern you? Jake paused for several seconds this time. The silence stretched long enough that even the audience seemed unsure what would happen next. Finally, Jake spoke again. Not really. Sunny's eyebrows lifted slightly. No. Jake shook his head. Because audiences are smarter than that. A wave of applause came from several sections of the studio. Jake continued. Most people understand the difference between a character and the person playing them. Sunny tilted her head slightly. And the ones who don't. Jake smiled again. Well, that's where conversations like this come in. The audience laughed softly. For a brief moment, the tension eased again. But then Sunny asked one final question. Her voice remained calm, but the seriousness behind it was unmistakable. Jake, she said, if audiences are as thoughtful as you believe, then why do interviews like this spark such intense reactions online? Jake looked at her carefully. It was clear he understood exactly where she was going. He leaned forward slowly, and when he answered, his voice carried a quiet intensity that immediately silenced the room. Because, he said, people aren't just reacting to what's being said. Sunny's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? Jake's gaze moved briefly toward one of the cameras, then back to Sunny. They're reacting to how it's framed. The audience murmured again. Jake continued. And sometimes the framing of a conversation can turn curiosity into conflict. The room went completely still. Sunny sat back slightly in her chair. For the first time during the entire interview, she didn't respond immediately. Because everyone in the studio suddenly realized something. The conversation itself had become the story. And by the time the cameras stopped rolling, the fallout from this tense exchange between Jake Gyllenhaal and Sunny Hostin would explode far beyond the studio walls. The silence after that statement felt heavier than anything that had happened during the entire interview. On the brightly lit set of The View, The audience sat completely still. The conversation between Jake Gyllenhaal and Sunny Hostin had slowly evolved from a routine promotional interview into something far more intense, something that now felt almost philosophical. Jake's words still echoed in the room. Sometimes the framing of a conversation can turn curiosity into conflict. Sunny leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him. For the first time since the segment began, she didn't immediately respond with another question. The audience watched both of them carefully, waiting to see who would speak next. Finally, Sunny broke the silence. "Well," she said calmly, "this conversation certainly became one." A few people in the audience laughed nervously. Jake gave a small smile. That tends to happen when people care about what they're discussing. Sunny nodded slowly. "That's true." The tension that had filled the room moments ago began to soften just slightly. Not completely, but enough that the conversation no longer felt like it was on the edge of exploding. One of the other hosts at the table leaned forward with a light laugh. "Well, I think this might be the most philosophical interview we've had this season." The audience chuckled, grateful for the moment of relief. Sunny smiled faintly as well, but she quickly turned back toward Jake. "I'll give you this," she said. "You're very thoughtful about the way you approach these conversations." Jake shrugged modestly. "I try to be." Sunny nodded. "And I appreciate you engaging with the questions." Jake smiled again. "I appreciate the questions." For a brief moment, it almost felt like the storm had passed. But the audience could still feel the weight of everything that had been said. Sunny glanced toward the cameras. "Well," she said, "whether people agree with you or not, I think it's safe to say viewers are going to have a lot to talk about after this." The audience clapped lightly. Jake chuckled. "That's kind of the point of storytelling." Sunny smiled. "And conversation." The host beside her nodded. And judging by this audience, the conversation definitely worked. The crowd applauded louder now, some people even standing briefly as the tension gave way to excitement. But the real explosion didn't happen inside the studio. It happened after the show ended. Within minutes of the segment airing, clips of the interview began spreading across social media. Short moments of the exchange, Sunny's sharp questions, Jake's calm but pointed replies, started appearing everywhere. Viewers debated every sentence. Some praised Jake for staying composed and thoughtful under pressure. Others applauded Sunny for asking difficult questions that many interviewers avoid. Comment sections filled with arguments, analysis, and passionate opinions. Some users wrote that the exchange was one of the most intelligent celebrity interviews they had seen in years. Others insisted the tension proved exactly how complicated conversations about art and responsibility have become. Entertainment blogs began publishing headlines. Jake Gyllenhaal pushes back during intense interview. Sunny Hostin challenges Hollywood storytelling. Fans divided after heated discussion on The View. Clips from the moment when Jake said, "Sometimes the questions say as much about the person asking them," quickly went viral. Within hours, millions of viewers had watched the segment. Some people replayed it again and again, analyzing body language, tone, and every subtle shift in the conversation. Even media commentators joined the debate, discussing whether the interview represented healthy dialogue or unnecessary confrontation. Back in the studio, after the cameras stopped rolling, the atmosphere had already begun to relax. Jake stood up from the table and shook hands with the hosts. Sunny offered a polite smile. "Well," she said lightly, "that was certainly memorable." Jake laughed. "I think we can both agree on that." The audience members who remained in the studio applauded again as he waved before heading backstage. But outside the studio, the moment had taken on a life of its own. On talk shows, podcasts, and news panels, commentators debated who had won the conversation. Was Jake right that art should challenge people without needing to explain itself? Or was Sunny right that powerful storytelling carries responsibility? The truth, many viewers realized, might lie somewhere in between. Because the real power of the moment wasn't in who had the stronger argument. It was in the fact that millions of people were suddenly discussing ideas that rarely appear in daytime television. And that's why the interview between Jake Gyllenhaal and Sunny Hostin became one of those rare moments people couldn't stop talking about. Not because it was loud, but because it was intense, thoughtful, and real. And now the question moves to you. What did you think about that conversation? Do you agree with Jake's view that storytelling should explore difficult ideas without being responsible for how audiences interpret them? Or do you think Sunny was right to push for accountability when stories influence culture? Tell us your opinion in the comments below, because your voice is part of the conversation too. And if you enjoy dramatic, intense stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to Live Narratives, like the video, and share it with someone who loves powerful celebrity moments. Because the next story might be even more explosive. Clapperboard fire.